Texas, August 1944. The freight train screeched to a halt under the blazing sun. Inside the cars, hundreds of captured German soldiers sat in silence, uniforms stiff with dust from Normandy. They expected barbed wire, dogs, and clubs. Many had whispered that Americans killed prisoners. When the doors slid open, blinding light poured in. Instead of shouting guards, there were men in clean uniforms offering cigarettes and water. Trucks waited to take them not to a dungeon, but to a sprawling camp lined with neat wooden barracks and trimmed lawns. Inside the mess hall, the prisoners froze. On metal trays lay steaming potatoes, bread with butter, and a dessert they hadn't tasted in years, chocolate ice cream. A guard, half smiling, told them to eat. Some hesitated, thinking it a trick. Others cried quietly as they swallowed. That night, a projector flickered to life in the camp yard. A black-and-white American film filled a white canvas sheet. Laughter echoed through the fences. For men who had survived Stalingrad and Normandy, it felt unreal. They had entered captivity expecting humiliation. Instead, they found decency, and it unsettled them more than fear ever could. By the summer of 1944, the Second World War had reached its violent crescendo. Across Europe, Allied armies were breaking through German lines in Normandy and pushing up the Italian peninsula. Entire Wehrmacht divisions were collapsing under relentless air power and mechanized warfare. In just a few months, tens of thousands of German soldiers laid down their arms. But surrender didn't mean safety. They knew what their own army had done to prisoners. In the East, Soviet retribution was merciless. Captured Germans vanished into camps where survival was measured in weeks. Even in the West, propaganda had told them the Americans were no better, that they tortured captives or sent them to hard labor until they died. When the Allies captured so many that frontline prisons overflowed, the question became, what to do with them all? By mid-1944, over 350,000 German prisoners had already crossed the Atlantic under guard, shipped quietly in Liberty vessels that would otherwise return empty. By the end of the war, that number would exceed 425,000, scattered across nearly every U.S. state. It was one of the largest prisoner transfers in history, and one of the most carefully planned. The United States faced a moral and logistical test unlike anything before. The Geneva Convention of 1929 demanded humane treatment for prisoners, adequate food, shelter, medical care, and recreation. Yet few nations during total war had followed those ideals. Many American officers, hardened by the brutality of combat, argued that resources should go to their own troops, not to the enemy. Food was rationed. Cities were dimmed under blackout. Every scrap of steel and every gallon of gasoline was precious. Still, Washington made a decision that would surprise even its allies. The United States would uphold the Geneva Convention completely, even for Germans. The reasoning was both practical and moral. Officials feared that mistreating prisoners might endanger American POWs in German hands. But there was also something deeper, a conviction that democratic civilization must prove its worth, even to its enemies. As one War Department memo stated in 1943, how we treat our captives will be read as a measure of what we fight. 4. To accommodate the flood of prisoners, America built more than 600 camps across its territory, from Maine to California, from the humid fields of Georgia to the plains of Nebraska. Each camp was surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, but inside, the layout resembled a small town. Barracks, kitchens, canteens, workshops, and even chapels. The camps were administered by the Provost Marshal General's office, which issued strict guidelines: no physical punishment, access to medical care, and pay for labor in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Most were located near agricultural or industrial zones. America's young men were fighting overseas, leaving farms and factories short of labor. German POWs filled that gap, harvesting crops, cutting timber, and maintaining infrastructure. They were paid in camp tokens they could use to buy cigarettes, toiletries, or stationery. What they found in those camps would upend everything they had believed about their enemy. For many prisoners, the shock began even before reaching the camps. Crossing the Atlantic, they saw how enormous American logistics truly were. Ships laden with food, airplanes overhead, ports filled with machines beyond imagination. When they landed in places like Boston, New Orleans, or Norfolk, civilians sometimes waved at them, not with hatred, but with curiosity. As trains carried them inland, the land seemed endless. Instead of ruins, they saw green fields, paved roads, and towns untouched by bombing. To men who had grown up amid propaganda about decadent America, it was a revelation. At the first camps, they were deloused, issued clean uniforms marked PW, and examined by doctors. There were beds with mattresses, kitchens with running water, and dining halls serving meat, vegetables, and, to universal astonishment, dessert. One prisoner later wrote, "It was the first time in years I ate until I was full. We could not believe it. In Europe, cities still burned." In concentration camps, millions were dying. Yet, across the ocean, the same nation that bombed German cities was feeding its captured soldiers hot meals and letting them watch movies. It was not pity, it was principle. The U.S. government insisted that adherence to law distinguished civilization from barbarism. The same military that fought with ruthless efficiency on the battlefield could show restraint in victory. For German prisoners indoctrinated with the image of America as weak and materialistic, the contradiction was dizzying. In their defeat, they encountered not vengeance, but decency, and for many, that first moment, the taste of food, the warmth of clean clothes, the sight of a smiling guard, marked the beginning of an unexpected education in humanity. By late 1944, hundreds of camps dotted the American landscape. From Camp Hearne in Texas to Camp Algona in Iowa and Fort Devens in Massachusetts, they formed a hidden network spread across small towns and farmland. Each was ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers, yet inside the fences life moved with an order few expected from war. The camps ran on strict routine: reveille at 6, breakfast at 7, roll call under guard, then work details assigned by interpreters. At night, curfews, lights out, and silence. Discipline was firm but never cruel. Punishment for infractions meant loss of privileges, not beatings or starvation. The American Guards, often older reservists or wounded veterans, followed a manual that began with one sentence: "A prisoner of war is still a human being." Every week, Red Cross inspectors toured the compounds, checking food, water, and sanitation. Reports were meticulous. They compared rations with those served to American troops and found them nearly identical. The result was astonishing. Most POWs gained weight during captivity. To fill wartime labor shortages, Washington organized the Prisoner of War Labor Program. Under Geneva rules, non-officer POWs could work for modest pay. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested corn in Iowa, felled timber in Oregon, and packed fruit in California. Farmers who had lost sons to the front watched in quiet irony as former enemy soldiers kept their livelihoods alive. Many treated the workers with cautious respect. A few brought them lemonade or tobacco in the fields. Local newspapers carried uneasy headlines. Nazis help pick our crops. But over time, fear softened into curiosity. Each prisoner earned 80 cents a day in camp coupons, enough to buy cigarettes, razor blades, toothpaste, or even postage stamps to write home. The letters, censored but delivered, often carried the same phrase: "We are treated well, better than we deserve." Evenings in the camps felt oddly domestic. Prisoners built furniture from scrap lumber, formed orchestras, and staged plays. Camp Hearne's POW theater produced Shakespeare and German comedies. Audiences included American guards who clapped and laughed. Each camp had a library stocked by the YMCA. Thousands of donated books in English and German. Classes were offered in mathematics, languages, and engineering. Some men studied for university exams they hoped to take after the war. Others learned carpentry or agriculture. And then there were the movies. Once a week, projectors rolled in the recreation halls. Hollywood films, Casablanca, It's a Wonderful Life, Sergeant York, played to rapt audiences. For men raised on Nazi propaganda, seeing ordinary Americans portrayed as humorous, moral, and human was disarming. At Christmas, guards distributed candy and cocoa. Choirs sang both carols and Stille Nacht. One officer wrote in his diary, "They have given us a holiday, though we are their enemies. This I cannot understand." The longer they stayed, the more the propaganda of home unraveled. Many had been taught that American society was ruled by chaos and greed, that its people were lazy and decadent. Yet here they saw efficiency without cruelty, abundance without arrogance. Inside the camps, ideological divisions deepened. Hardened Nazis tried to maintain control, threatening fellow prisoners who praised their captors. Camp administrators eventually separated the extremists into isolated compounds. The majority, especially younger conscripts, began to see the war differently. Interviews after the war revealed the same realization repeated like confession. We were defeated not only by their weapons, but by their character. By early 1945, life in many camps resembled a self-contained village. There were soccer leagues, barbershops, bakeries, and clinics. Red Cross shipments brought soap, bandages, and, to the prisoners' astonishment, chocolate. Ice cream appeared on Sundays, served from army kitchens that followed the same menu rotation as U.S. soldiers abroad. For men who had marched across bombed-out Europe, the normality was surreal. They could see American children bicycling outside the fence, hear church bells on Sundays, smell barbecue smoke from nearby farms. Some guards spoke German and chatted easily. When the war in Europe ended that May, many prisoners wept, not from fear, but from uncertainty about leaving a country that had treated them with dignity. Their time in captivity had become something more than survival. It was an encounter with the very ideals their leaders had denied existed. Fairness, restraint, humanity. The daily life inside those fences formed the foundation for a transformation that would soon reach far beyond the camps themselves. A quiet revolution of minds and loyalties. For the German soldier stepping off the train into captivity, fear was instinct. Every rumor from the front had described Americans as cruel conquerors. Many expected starvation or execution. Yet, within hours, those expectations began to collapse. At Camp Swift, Texas, prisoners were given soap, clean clothes, and food. At Fort Custer, Michigan, medics treated even the wounded enemy with precision and respect. The small acts shocked them more than any speech could. A guard offering a cigarette, a nurse smiling during an injection, a chaplain inviting them to Sunday service. Letters smuggled through censors spoke of the same astonishment. They feed us well, even meat and coffee. We are not beaten. I think the Americans are not what we were told. For men who had survived the Russian front, it was disorienting to be treated not as animals, but as men. Slowly, a strange gratitude emerged. The same hands that had fired on them now handed them books, chocolate, even musical instruments. The dissonance was profound. Some wept in private. Others grew quiet, almost ashamed. They began to wonder what kind of nation could show decency even to its enemies, and what kind of system had lied to them about it. The first spoonful of ice cream, the first American cigarette, became moments of revelation. To a generation raised on totalitarian discipline, small kindness felt revolutionary. Beyond the fences, America revealed itself not as propaganda's caricature of chaos, but as an orderly abundance. German POWs marveled at the endless food, the manicured farms, the factories that never slept. Even from captivity, they sensed a country fueled by confidence rather than fear. Inside the camps, the War Department saw an opportunity. Civic organizations, churches, and universities sent books and lecturers to expose prisoners to American culture. They screened films not for propaganda, but for understanding. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, The Grapes of Wrath, and Chaplin's Modern Times. The message was simple. This is democracy. Noisy, imperfect, but free. For many prisoners, those movies were their first glimpse of ordinary Americans as moral, humorous, and compassionate. Nothing like the greedy caricatures in Nazi newsreels. They saw interracial work crews, women in uniform, citizens arguing openly without fear. To some, it was confusing. To others, liberating. Music deepened the impact. Jazz, banned under Hitler, drifted through the barracks from guard radios. Louis Armstrong, Glenn Miller, and Bing Crosby became the unspoken soundtrack of the camps. Young Germans hummed swing tunes under their breath, half guilty, half thrilled. The effect spread beyond the fences. Local Americans sometimes heard music from the POW compounds and responded in kind, waving from a distance, occasionally tossing records over the wire. Gradually, curiosity replaced hostility on both sides. For a moment in history, culture became a bridge stronger than any wall of barbed wire. Inside every camp, two wars unfolded. One external, one internal. The external war was over. The internal one raged inside the prisoners' minds. Among the captives were devout Nazis who clung to loyalty and fear. They formed secret cells, hoisted makeshift flags, and threatened those who spoke kindly of the Americans. To them, good treatment was psychological warfare, an attempt to corrupt their will. But for most prisoners, the propaganda that had once shaped them began to dissolve. The contradiction between what they had been told and what they now lived was too wide to ignore. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, a captured sergeant admitted during an interview, "If this is enemy civilization, then we were blind." That blindness gave way to introspection. With time and safety, many faced questions they had buried during the war. What had Germany really done? What had they fought for? Psychologists assigned to the camps noted remarkable transformations. Former ideologues began attending language classes, volunteering for work, and writing poetry. They debated politics, read newspapers, and cautiously discussed the atrocities they had only heard whispers of. The American Guards, many ordinary men from farms and small towns, became unwitting ambassadors of democracy. They didn't preach. They simply behaved with fairness. That quiet decency broke through indoctrination more effectively than propaganda ever could. For the first time, many of these young soldiers experienced what freedom of thought felt like, even behind fences. By 1945, the US Army began formal re-education programs known as Der Ruf, the Call, distributing magazines that emphasized truth, tolerance, and responsibility. Thousands of POWs participated willingly. One later recalled, "We came as enemies. We left as students." The transformation was not universal. Some remained bitter, others fearful of returning to ruins. But the seed had been planted. The idea that compassion could be stronger than ideology, and that dignity could exist even in defeat. Within the calm order of American camps, the war's harshest paradox unfolded. While Europe lay in ashes, the vanquished were rediscovering their humanity under the care of their conquerors. That moral and cultural awakening was only beginning, and it would soon collide with politics, propaganda, and the question of what to do with 400,000 men whose loyalties were quietly shifting behind barbed wire. For the Nazi regime, German soldiers taken by the Allies were supposed to be victims of barbarism. State radio warned that Americans were merciless, that prisoners would be starved or executed. In reality, the POWs in America were writing home about chocolate, libraries, and baseball. Censors in Berlin intercepted letters from soldiers describing good food and friendly guards. Those letters were quietly destroyed. Goebbels's propaganda ministry panicked. Truth was leaking from the enemy's camps. A single line like, "We eat better here than in the Wehrmacht," threatened to shatter morale. In some units, men began surrendering more readily to Western allies, desperate to avoid capture by the Soviets. Wehrmacht officers blamed these soft tales for weakening discipline. To counter it, Nazi propaganda shifted tone, claiming the Americans used comfort as a weapon, a trick to corrupt German loyalty. But the damage was done. News of humane treatment circulated through rumor and word of mouth, filtering back through Red Cross exchanges and letters that slipped through censorship. By 1945, thousands of soldiers heading to the Western Front carried a new, unspoken calculation. Surrendering to Americans might mean survival. Humanity itself had become a form of psychological warfare, one far more effective than any weapon. Behind the compassion was deliberate policy. The United States did not stumble into decency by accident. It chose it. From Washington, the War Department issued precise instructions for the care of POWs, codified in manuals that referenced the Geneva Convention line by line. President Roosevelt and General Eisenhower both approved policies forbidding abuse and mandating cultural respect. The reasoning extended beyond morality. American leaders understood that wars were not only fought with bullets, but with ideas. If democracy was to defeat fascism, it had to show the world what civilization under law looked like. Major General Alan Gullion, head of the Provost Marshal General's office, phrased it bluntly, "We fight for principles. To mistreat prisoners would be to betray them." The same logic reached down to the smallest camp. Commandants were trained to keep order through consistency, not cruelty. The Red Cross was granted full access, an act of transparency unheard of in Nazi Germany. Economically, the POW labor program benefited both sides. America filled its wartime labor shortages. Prisoners earned dignity through work. It was mutual pragmatism framed in morality, a perfect alignment of values and utility. By 1945, the policy's results were undeniable. Discipline within the camps remained high. Escapes were rare, and public relations favorable. The United States had managed the impossible, controlling hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers without sacrificing its principles. In an age of total war, that restraint became a quiet triumph of its own. At its heart, the POW experience revealed a paradox. Mercy, when offered sincerely, could wield greater power than hatred. The Americans who guarded the camps were not saints. They were men who had seen battle, lost friends, and often despised the enemy. Yet their discipline, their refusal to descend into vengeance, became a moral act as potent as any victory in Normandy or the Ardennes. For the German prisoners, this restraint was disarming. They came expecting humiliation and instead encountered fairness. It forced them to confront their own nation's moral collapse. Some began asking why Germany had built camps of death, while America built camps of decency. That question lingered like a wound, one that reopened with every hot meal, every song, every act of ordinary kindness. Historians would later call it re-education through experience. There were no lectures, no propaganda leaflets, only exposure to a system that lived its ideals. It turned the enemy's expectations inside out. Years later, former POWs would recall their confusion vividly. One remembered standing in line for ice cream beside an American guard who had lost a brother in France. He smiled at me, the prisoner said. That moment broke something in me. I realized I had believed in a lie. In that realization lay the true moral victory of the United States. The war had been fought to destroy tyranny. But within those fences, America proved that strength and compassion were not opposites. By 1945, the contrast between the Reich's brutality and America's discipline had become impossible to ignore, for prisoners, civilians, and historians alike. And as the war ended, the experiment in mercy would evolve into something even more remarkable: friendship, redemption, and the rebirth of trust between former enemies. By the winter of 1944, the war had turned decisively against Germany. Inside the United States, however, life inside the POW camps had taken on an unexpected rhythm. Steady, structured, almost peaceful. For thousands of captured soldiers, captivity no longer felt like punishment. It felt like awakening. They worked by day and rested by night. Their rations came like clockwork. Their guards followed rules, and the violence of Europe seemed impossibly far away. Letters home carried a single theme repeated again and again. We live better here than we did as soldiers. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, men harvested wheat for local farmers. In Camp Algona, Iowa, prisoners built a life-sized nativity scene for Christmas, carved by hand from local wood, illuminated by lights, admired by American townspeople through the barbed wire. Guards invited their families to see it. Children waved. Some even passed gifts through the fence. The same young men who once shouted, "Heil Hitler," now sang "Silent Night," in harmony with the people they had been taught to hate. It was not propaganda. It was something far quieter. empathy rediscovered through routine. The change worked both ways. At first, many American guards were suspicious, even resentful. Some had lost brothers in North Africa or Italy. Watching German soldiers eat the same food as American GIs felt wrong. But as months passed, hostility faded. Guards began talking to prisoners, trading jokes, learning words of German. They discovered that most were not fanatics, just young men conscripted into a machine larger than themselves. The illusion of the faceless enemy evaporated. A sergeant at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, wrote in his diary, "They remind me of us. They miss home. They love letters and cigarettes. I can't hate them when I see them laugh." That realization echoed through small towns across America. Local farmers who hired POW laborers often returned home astonished. These were not monsters. They were polite, hard-working, and grateful. In some communities, trust grew strong enough that prisoners worked unguarded. One farmer in Texas later recalled, "They picked cotton in our fields all summer. We fed them lunch under the trees. By fall, they felt like neighbors." What began as wartime pragmatism had become a social experiment in empathy. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were allowed to work, but not in industries related to the war. The War Department used that clause to turn captivity into rehabilitation. Men who once fought for conquest now built for life. Digging irrigation ditches, repairing roads, tending orchards. The labor restored not only America's wartime economy, but the prisoners' sense of self-worth. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, a group of engineers constructed model bridges from scrap wood and string to teach American soldiers combat engineering. They volunteered. "We want to be useful," one of them said. At Camp Crossville, Tennessee, prisoners published newsletters, composed poems, and painted landscapes of the American countryside. Their art reflected something new: tranquility. One watercolor, titled "The Land Without Fear," depicted rolling hills and barns under a blue sky. Freedom had become psychological, not physical. That December, as the Battle of the Bulge raged across Europe, snow began to fall on Camp Algona. Inside the wire, prisoners decorated pine trees with hand-carved ornaments. The camp commandant, Captain Arthur Lobdell, allowed them to hold a Christmas concert. As the music began, hundreds of voices, prisoners and guards alike, joined in singing Stille Nacht. The melody drifted through the frosted air, over the barbed wire, out into the Iowa plains. For a moment, there was no war. A local reporter who attended the concert wrote later, "The enemy sang of peace, and we listened. I think we all understood something that night." For the prisoners, it was the first time they had felt dignity since the war began. For the Americans, it was proof that humanity could survive even the worst conflict in history. One German private summed it up years later. "They could have hated us. Instead, they reminded us what it meant to be human." By 1945, the transformation was undeniable. Inside the camps, Nazi insignia disappeared. Prisoners formed discussion circles about democracy and morality. Re-education officers distributed reading material on freedom, responsibility, and truth. Many prisoners devoured them eagerly. One program, Der Ruf, The Call, published essays written by German POWs who now believed that democracy, not dictatorship, was Germany's future. Copies were later reprinted in post-war Germany. In hindsight, the American camps had become more than holding facilities. They were laboratories of moral reconstruction. Soldiers who had marched for a dictator now queued for ice cream, debated ethics, and listened to jazz. They entered the wire as instruments of tyranny and left as witnesses to tolerance. The transformation wasn't perfect. Ideology dies hard. But something irreversible had begun. And soon, as the war collapsed in Europe, that quiet revolution inside the wire would meet the brutal chaos outside it, where news of death camps and devastation reached even those protected by American kindness. What the German POWs had learned about mercy would soon collide with what they would learn about guilt. In April 1945, the camp radios crackled with news from Europe. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was dead. The Reich had fallen. Inside America's prison camps, silence followed. Thousands of German soldiers gathered around speakers in stunned disbelief. For 5 years, they had fought for a cause they thought eternal. Now, it was gone. At first came relief. The war was over. They would live. But within days, another shock arrived. Newspapers and newsreels began showing photographs from liberated concentration camps. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. For the German POWs, the images were unbearable. Some refused to believe them. Others wept openly. In several camps, officers tore down Nazi flags and insignia. At Camp McCoy, a group of prisoners burned their swastika armbands without orders. One former sergeant later recalled, "We thought we were soldiers. Then we saw what our army had done. It was as if the ground opened under us." For the first time, they confronted the moral truth of the regime they had served. The shock deepened when the Americans didn't gloat. No lectures, no vengeance, just quiet disappointment. Guards handed out newspapers without comment. The prisoners read in silence. Mercy had been their teacher. Now it became their mirror. As spring turned to summer, the U.S. government began repatriation plans. Trains filled with POWs rolled to the coasts for the long journey home. Yet few felt triumphant. Many dreaded what awaited them. Germany lay in ruins. Cities bombed flat. Families scattered. Hunger spreading. Letters from home described destruction beyond imagining. Cologne was rubble. Dresden was ashes. Some prisoners received word that their entire towns no longer existed. In that context, the American camps began to feel like islands of stability. Even as they packed to leave, many POWs looked around their barracks with strange affection. The walls that once symbolized captivity had become walls of safety. Some pleaded to stay longer, offering to work as farmhands or mechanics. Others wrote heartfelt letters to camp commanders, thanking them for their decency. A few even married American women after the war, returning years later as citizens. At Camp Atterbury, Indiana, a farewell ceremony was held before repatriation. The German prisoners sang both the American and German national anthems. When they finished, an American officer addressed them simply. "You came here as soldiers of a fallen army. You leave as men who have seen another way." Many never forgot that moment. When repatriation began in late 1945, many prisoners left the camps carrying notebooks filled with English phrases, drawings and addresses of American guards and families. Months later, letters began to cross the Atlantic. Awkward, heartfelt attempts to maintain contact. They spoke of gratitude, curiosity, even friendship. One former prisoner wrote from Hamburg, "You showed me what Germany forgot, that honor can exist without hate." American newspapers occasionally printed these letters as small human interest stories. Readers were struck by their humility. "Our enemy thanks us," one headline read. In post-war Germany, these returned POWs became quiet ambassadors. They told friends and families about the America they had seen, the fair treatment, the music, the freedom to speak one's mind. In a landscape haunted by guilt, those memories became seeds of hope. Sociologists later called it the POW generation's quiet re-education. Without classrooms or propaganda, these men had absorbed democratic values through lived experience. They had seen a society governed by law, not fear, and they carried that vision home. Not all could reconcile what they had learned with what they now knew. For some, the guilt of association was crushing. They had been fed, clothed, and entertained by the same nation that exposed their homeland's crimes. One camp chaplain noted, in his journal, "They cannot understand how we show mercy while showing them the truth. They ask why we do not hate them. I tell them, because that is what hate would want." That response, quiet and simple, became emblematic of America's moral stance. Psychologists interviewing former POWs in 1946 found recurring emotions: gratitude, shame, confusion, and respect. One summarized it perfectly. "We lost the war, but we met the civilization that won it, and it was not what we imagined." When they finally returned home, most faced suspicion from their own people. Former Nazis accused them of being Americanized. But many held their ground. They defended what they had seen: discipline without cruelty, patriotism without hatred. Their stories spread in taverns, universities, and Reconstruction offices. By the 1950s, as West Germany rebuilt under democratic rule, many of its civic leaders and teachers had once been POWs in the United States. They had carried home the blueprint of a moral victory. In late 1946, the last German prisoners boarded ships back to Europe. As they sailed from New York, they saw the Statue of Liberty glowing in the distance, a symbol they now understood better than ever before. One of them, a young corporal named Erich Fromm, no relation to the philosopher, wrote in his diary, "The light on that statue, that is what they gave us. They showed us light without chains. When he returned to Bremen, he used his savings, from POW wages, to buy chocolate for children in his bombed neighborhood. He told them it was from America. His gesture, small and symbolic, was echoed thousands of times across Germany. Chocolate, kindness, forgiveness." The war had begun with fire and fanaticism. It ended for these men with ice cream, jazz, and a glimpse of a better humanity. In that quiet reversal lay the climax of a story no weapon could have written. The transformation of hatred through decency, of prisoners into witnesses, and of enemies into men reborn by mercy. And as the ships disappeared over the Atlantic, they carried not just soldiers home, but the seeds of reconciliation that would shape the peace to come. When the war finally ended, the German Reich was gone. Its cities destroyed, its people hungry, its soul in ruins. Millions of returning soldiers wandered across a landscape of ash and silence. But among them came a different kind of returnee. Men who had seen another world, lived under another system, and been treated not as monsters, but as men. They were the former POWs of the United States. By 1946, most of the 425,000 Germans held in America had been repatriated through ports in France and Britain. They returned home to a nation unrecognizable, families scattered, industry shattered, ideology discredited. Yet unlike many who came from the Eastern Front or Soviet camps, these men carried no hatred, no thirst for vengeance. They carried memory of fairness, order, and humanity experienced behind American fences. They told stories few Germans believed at first. Stories of camps where the guards followed rules, of food served on clean trays, of libraries and movies, jazz music and Christmas trees, of Americans who offered ice cream instead of interrogation. Many at home dismissed them as naive or brainwashed, but over time their testimony spread. Villages listened. Schools invited them to speak. The myth of the barbaric enemy collapsed under the quiet weight of personal truth. Sociologists later found that returning POWs from America showed distinct differences in attitude. They were less nationalistic, more skeptical of authority, and more open to new political ideas. Many had learned English, read American literature, and absorbed the rhythms of a free society through daily contact. In post-war Germany, those men became teachers, engineers, and local administrators. Some entered politics. Others joined reconstruction projects led by the Allies. A few even became part of the new Bundeswehr after 1955, bringing with them a philosophy of discipline without fanaticism, professionalism over ideology. In the EDI towns of West Germany, these former POWs became quiet architects of change. They taught their children about fairness, not obedience, about law, not fear. What they had seen in captivity became the moral blueprint for a democratic rebirth. A former prisoner from Camp Algona wrote in 1948, "We did not learn democracy from speeches. We learned it from how they treated us." That insight became a cornerstone of post-war thought. The belief that democracy is not only a system of government, but a way of being. The bonds forged in captivity did not fade with peace. Letters continued to pass between former POWs and American families. Some farmers in Iowa and Texas received Christmas cards for decades from men who once worked their fields. In 1955, a group of former prisoners returned to Camp Hearne, Texas, now abandoned. They placed a small plaque on the site. It read, "Here we learned that humanity is stronger than hate." Many others immigrated to the United States, drawn by the same freedom they had once seen through barbed wire. They became citizens, craftsmen, and neighbors in the country that had once held them captive. This quiet migration symbolized something larger: reconciliation not through treaties or politics, but through memory and respect. Historians looking back called it one of the most successful humanitarian experiments of the 20th century. The United States had proven that decency and victory could reshape the defeated more profoundly than punishment ever could. While Europe struggled with vengeance and despair, the American camps had already planted the first moral foundations of the post-war world. Their success wasn't born of propaganda or manipulation. It was born of consistency. The same guards who enforced discipline also enforced fairness. The same system that fought ruthlessly abroad remained just at home. That consistency was what impressed the Germans most. They had been taught that democracy was weak, sentimental, unfit for war. Yet they discovered that democracy, when disciplined, could win wars and still keep its soul. In the years that followed, The memory of that paradox, mercy inside war, would linger across Germany like a quiet echo. But its meaning would only deepen as the Cold War divided the world, and the former enemies found themselves allies against a new threat. In the years after the war, as Germany rebuilt from the ruins, something extraordinary happened. The men, who had once been its prisoners, became America's quietest allies. The lessons they carried home from the camps, discipline, fairness, respect, took root in the ashes of defeat. When the Marshall Plan began in 1948, many former POWs were among those who helped distribute supplies, rebuild bridges, and coordinate relief. They understood the American system instinctively. Efficient, organized, focused on cooperation rather than domination, and when U.S. troops returned to West Germany as part of the post-war occupation, they found a population surprisingly receptive. There was resentment, yes, but also curiosity, even warmth. Many Germans, influenced by stories from returned POWs, saw the Americans not as conquerors, but as potential partners. One U.S. colonel stationed in Bavaria wrote home in 1949, "It is remarkable. The same men who fought against us now invite us for coffee. They talk about the camps as if they were schools, not prisons." That was no exaggeration. For thousands of former POWs, the memory of ice cream and movies, of humane guards and fair treatment, had become a moral reference point. They knew what America stood for because they had lived it firsthand. Through the 1950s and 1960s, veterans organizations on both sides of the Atlantic began reconnecting. Former POWs returned to visit the towns where they had once been held: Camp Hearne, Camp Algona, Camp Swift. Places that once symbolized captivity became sites of reunion. Newspapers printed photographs of German veterans shaking hands with aging American guards, smiling beside plaques that read, "Enemies no more." One such veteran, Carl Miller, had been captured in Tunisia in 1943 and spent 2 years in a camp in Nebraska. When he revisited in 1960, he brought with him a box of chocolates for the local children. He told a reporter, "It was chocolate that made me trust America. I wanted their children to taste what I tasted: kindness." His words reflected a broader truth. For many Germans, those small gestures of humanity had become lifelong symbols of hope. American families, too, remembered. Some farmers who had employed POW labor kept their correspondence alive for decades. A few even traveled to Germany years later, welcomed as guests in the homes of their former workers. These relationships formed a network of personal diplomacy, unrecorded, unofficial, but profoundly influential. It was reconciliation built, not by governments, but by individuals who had once seen each other across barbed wire. Historians now view the U.S. handling of German POWs as one of the moral successes of the war. It demonstrated that civilization could survive total war without losing its principles. The policy wasn't born of sentiment. It was born of foresight. The Americans knew that how they treated their prisoners would one day shape how the world judged their victory. And they were right. When West Germany became a democracy and an ally during the Cold War, much of the goodwill that sustained that alliance had its roots in those wartime camps. The trust between the two nations wasn't built in treaties. It was built in mess halls and farm fields, over cups of coffee and spoons of ice cream. In interviews decades later, former prisoners still spoke of America with gratitude. "They gave us back our humanity," said one. "I learned what freedom feels like before I ever saw my country free," said another. Even among historians of warfare, such stories remain unique, proof that compassion can serve as strategy, and that mercy, when disciplined, can be a weapon of peace. Today, the remains of those POW camps still stand in quiet fields across America. Weathered watchtowers, crumbling barracks, memorial plaques hidden beneath trees. To passing travelers, they are relics. But to history, they mark something rare. A moment when a nation chose character over cruelty. In their time, they held the enemy. In memory, they hold the proof that victory without hatred is possible. The war had taught the world about destruction. The camps in America taught it something else. That even amid destruction, humanity can rebuild. Soon, the guns would fall silent forever. But the echo of those small kindnesses, chocolate, movies, ice cream, would linger across generations, softening what war had hardened. From the ashes of conflict, a friendship was born, not forged by treaties or armies, but by mercy strong enough to endure. Texas, 1944. A train door slides open, and frightened men step into the blinding American sun. They expect hatred. Instead, they smell food. They hear laughter. They taste ice cream for the first time in years. They do not yet know that this moment will follow them for the rest of their lives. For those German prisoners, captivity in America became something far greater than survival. It became revelation that strength and mercy could live side by side, that justice could wear a human face. Behind barbed wire, they found not humiliation, but dignity, and that dignity, once given, could never be forgotten. The United States had every reason to hate them, and chose not to. That choice echoed more loudly than any victory parade. It taught that true power does not lie in domination, but in restraint, not in punishment, but in principle. Years later, when these men returned to Germany, they carried that lesson home. They helped rebuild a nation that would rise not through conquest, but through conscience. The world that had begun in blood found renewal through kindness. Some of those camps still stand today. Silent fields with cracked concrete foundations and rusted wire. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear it still. The distant laughter of men watching a movie under the stars, the clink of spoons in metal bowls, the hum of a projector echoing through a quiet summer night. It was, perhaps, the gentlest victory of the Second World War, won not by fire or fury, but by compassion strong enough to survive the darkness. And somewhere, in memory, that first taste of ice cream remains, cold, sweet, and human.